Hey everyone, I'm Thane Rosenbaum. I'm the creative director of the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society at Touro University, and with our producing partners, our old friends, the 92 NY Talk series, and new friends of ours or co-producers, the National Coalition Against Censorship. Welcome to the FOLCS Conversation series. Tonight's conversation, censorship in the digital age. You know, we all know about deplatforming, where people are being prevented from appearing on a particular social media platform. But there's stuff that's even worse, right? Like the use of algorithms that are designed to limit your audience. You think you're talking to the world, and you're really not. There's a limit to who you're actually speaking to, as well as if you're using the internet for news, the way in which social media companies and other platforms tailor your news feeds, curate it for you so that you're locked in a silo. We have perfect group of people for this. Three very iconic, charming, well-known First Amendment people and civil liberties people. First, Lee Rowland, who is the executive director of the National Coalition Against Censorship, our new producing partner, she's an incredibly accomplished First Amendment attorney. She, even before this position, spent a number of years at both the ACLU and the New York Civil Liberties Union. So welcome, Lee Rowland. We have Alex Abdo, who is a litigation director at the Knight Institute at Columbia University. And guess what? He too has a longstanding association with the ACLU. I told you we had First Amendment people here. And Mike Masnick, an enormously interesting guy. He's the founder of the blog Techdirt, which covers the technology and civil liberties area. And he's a board member on Bluesky. And Bluesky bills itself as a social media company that is open sourced and doesn't do the kinds of algorithmic magic that some of these other social media companies engage in. So welcome, Lee, Alex, and Mike. Let's get straight to it. Do you think that we have a problem with censorship in social media? And I'll ask you why I want to know. It's not just because that's the title of the night. Is I thought that when Donald Trump took office and Elon Musk entered public life, that all of a sudden there was a change, that there had been a backlash against too much content moderation, too much curations, too much deplatforming of politicians that social media companies didn't want to hear, too much deprioritizing of certain links or certain things or certain ideas, and that there was a backing away. So is that any different, or do we still have a problem, or are we fixed?
God, Thane, I would say the problem might be deeper after the actions you cite, and I think you might have to start by actually, not to be pedantic about it, but defining censorship. I think often, especially for Americans, we think of free expression and the boundaries of the First Amendment as kind of being the same thing, and they're emphatically not. When we're talking online, we are reliant on private companies as the mediators, right? And our megaphones, they themselves are private entities. And under our First Amendment, they have the right generally to decide how they speak, how they associate, how they censor, or as they would call it, moderate content, right? So it's important, I think, to note we're in a kind of free speech 2.0 era where our First Amendment law really doesn't track in the same way into the digital world. So we actually have the challenge and maybe even opportunity of really defining what free expression and censorship looks like online, where the First Amendment is less of a regulatory force at the top.
That may be true, right? Because we know that the First Amendment applies to the government's restrictions on free speech, not private companies. That's why people were very confused about the Colin Kaepernick affair, because they said, well, what do you mean? Doesn't he have a right to do this? Well, not in uniform. No. Not in uniform. If the state of California had required all players to stand at attention, now that would be a First Amendment problem. But if the owners of the San Francisco 49ers say, stand up and hold your helmet and be respectful, that's a private company. And so, Lee, you're just saying, isn't that really the position that Facebook and Twitter, X, they're all in the same thing, except for one thing, is that this notion of the public square.
Yep.
right? That we have an understanding that we believe our founding fathers wanted us to get on soapboxes in public squares and have competing conversations. But we don't do that anymore. In fact, that's one anecdote I want to remind everyone. If we lived in England, we could go to Hyde Park and they have something called Speaker's Corner. They have it every weekend. And you could actually go, it's near Marble Arch, and they have people standing on little ladders and they're making speeches. And we don't really do that. We make speeches on social media. So and people learn their information on social media and the internet. And given that's different from, say, the San Francisco 49ers, that we are in a way deputizing social media companies and internet companies and search companies to play a quasi-governmental role. No? I mean, aren't we literally saying, you are the public square, so behave like it?
I think that's exactly the problem that you're getting at, Thane. So I would say that the main problem we have online is centralized control. I do think we also have a censorship problem. I think if you look, for example, at the laws passed by Florida and Texas that were an effort to directly mandate what the platforms can host and what they can't, that to me those are censorship laws.
Absolutely.
The main problem, though, that I think that people are focused on when it comes to social media is not censorship, but centralized control. We do have a handful of enormously powerful gatekeepers to what you just called the public square. I agree with Lee that the platforms have their own First Amendment rights to moderate those squares in the way that they like. What they don't have is a constitutional right to have a monopoly over the means of public discourse. And I think that's what legislators should be focused on, is depriving them, taking away from the platforms this centralized control. And there are a lot of ways to do that, but they mostly involve economic regulation designed to undermine their centralization of control over these limited public platforms. And we can get into that, but one example of what I'd like to see as a model for social media in the future is exactly what Mike is involved in, which is a platform like Bluesky, which goes out of its way to deprive itself of centralized control of what takes place on its platform by making itself sufficiently open to alternative means of sorting what's there, of giving other people the power to sort. So I'd love to hear Mike's perspective on that.
So
but that's
Mike,
how I think of the problem.
Is Bluesky the remedy? What you sit on that board? Are they the answer to our question that it's not censorship, it's centralized control, and you, through Bluesky, have decentralized control?
Well, we're trying to. I mean, there are a few different elements here. So I want to take one step back, and then I'll get to the Bluesky stuff. I think the framing of the question around censorship in the public square, I think that the analogy sometimes breaks down, and I think it gets confusing. I would like to think of the internet itself as the public square. That is a place where anyone can participate. They will rely on certain intermediaries, but with the internet, anyone can post things in a number of different places. That doesn't mean any one private entity within that arena should be required to host all speech. So I generally think that the framing of Facebook or Twitter or YouTube as being a public square, or Twitter or X or whoever, I think it's wrong to think of any of them individually as the public square. They are private entities on the public square. And if you don't like what they're doing, there are other places where you can express yourself. And to some extent, the framing of censorship here, I think, also distracts from the point, which is that at this moment, we have more most people have more ability to have their voice heard than any time in history.
But is that true?
I think it is absolutely true. I think it is undeniably true, because if you go back in history and you look, if you wanted to speak beyond just your neighbors or the people nearby, you had to rely on an intermediary who mostly wouldn't let you speak at all. You had newspapers or magazines or radio or TV or book publishers, or movie studios, record labels.
Saying high barriers to entry.
Exactly. And with the rise of the internet, what we got was more ability for more people to speak. You still relied on intermediaries, but most of them became intermediaries that were enabling more and more speech. The fact that they have certain rules that they will perhaps remove you from the service because you violate their rules, I don't think is an attack on speech. I think it's just that corner of the internet has enabled new rules for more people to do.
But it is an attack on speech. If any of these social media companies restrict the range of my audience. I go on social media per se, and I think, here I am, Thane Rosenbaum, I'm speaking to the whole world. But what I don't know is Facebook hates my guts. And they only want me to speak to my cousin. And he's the only person who gets my feed. He's it. So me and my cousin are talking, and I'm walking around in a delusional state, thinking I have an opportunity to get on my soapbox, and I have less of a soapbox than I do standing on one in a park.
Sure. Well, well, no, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think what is happening is you are relying on a particular intermediary, and you may have particular expectations of them, but they get to set some rules if you're using their property and their technology for things. That is what Bluesky is trying to do differently to get to Alex's point.
That's why I'm asking you. Right.
Yeah, which is that Bluesky is viewing it as, what if one company doesn't have so much control over the space, and that if we open up the system and allow others to offer their own services, that interconnects and interoperates with the rest of the people within that protocol, within that system, that enables for something new that we're just starting to see where that's going to lead.
So what you're all saying, go ahead, Lee.
And then you mentioned you were delusionally, right, hoping to talk to your cousin, right? I think there's something packed into there. There, I think, are two different concepts in there for me. One is, do you have a right to an audience, right? And generally, no. And that's true whether it's a soapbox or a website, right? Having a forum is different than having the megaphone, whether or not anyone is listening. But the delusional part actually speaks to a really important part of this that I think kind of gets back a little bit to Alex's comment about scale and monopoly, which is, you should, if we want to use the marketplace of ideas analogy, which I think in a lot of ways is helpful, right? As a consumer of speech reliant on these private intermediaries, you would like to think that you had a meaningful choice, right? That Bluesky represents one type of way of interacting with the speech medium, and I might choose another that's better for me. Because there are no rules right now, really, that social media companies or other platform hosts are very transparent with you and honest about what their content moderation algorithm is, when you've been censored, and they certainly don't really have to offer you what we think of as due process, right? So the possibility thing of the delusion for me is a huge issue. It goes to a separate question, which is right now, social media companies do have such a monopoly on the kind of market contenders for speech that they don't have to be responsive, I think, in a healthy way to what their consumers actually want, which is, more power, more control, and information about when they're being censored and what they can't say.
So since you're First Amendment crusaders, and Mike has a new platform out there that he works with that does it better, we'll say, for the purposes of today's discussion, why not make this an antitrust case? We know that these social media companies and internet companies are getting hammered by the Justice Department just recently, right? Alphabet, Google, all of them, Apple, they're getting hammered when it comes to their market power, when it comes to search, when it comes to advertisement. What if there was the way to respond are either through private antitrust actions or to say to the Justice Department, you know what? Here's another way to look at antitrust. They have dominant market position. And they in fact collude with each other. They hate Mike's guts. They don't want Mike to succeed. They hate him. They want to sabotage Mike. They don't like this open source idea. Who is he to come up with that fancy idea? So why is it that we're not hearing that as saying, let Lee Rowland have her way. Let it be that you give everyone the best chance possible to have their soapbox.
I think you are seeing, sorry, go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say, I mean, I don't think anyone denies that antitrust is a part of how this is going to go. But I think if you look at the way that antitrust law works and how it is working right now, is that it's a very messy process, right? We just got through a very, very long antitrust process with Google, which started under the first Trump administration. At the very end of the first Trump administration, we finally just now, 5 years later, got to a remedies point, and the remedies were fairly limited. And I don't think they're going to actually change the market in any significant way. And there may still be appeals. antitrust is slow, it's messy, it's clunky, it involves a huge process. And in fact, we're even seeing in the results of this antitrust ruling that just came down, the fact that the market itself has changed in the meantime. The judge himself was sort of shocked at how much that just between the original trial and now the remedies part of it, that AI search suddenly was changing the market for search for Google. So I don't think anyone, well, I don't want to speak for my other panelists, but like, I don't think anyone is against antitrust. I think it is a part of the equation, it is a piece of the puzzle, but it's slow and it's messy. And I think that there are other approaches that are more important in the meantime, including just building up something better. I mean, that is what Bluesky is trying to do, where they sort of feel that if they can build a product that is actually really, really good, people will start to move over to it. And it's what we've seen. There's 38 million people who have signed up for Bluesky in the last couple of years because they, you know, in some cases, they see this vision of something that is better where they have more control rather than some billionaire somewhere.
Alex, you want to add to that? Or should I move?
I do, because I agree with everything Mike said, and I would just add to it this, which is that you have to attack the core source of the problem. The reason why people don't leave Facebook, they don't leave X, or they don't leave, you know, some of these legacy social media companies, hopefully they'll become legacy social media companies, is not because they don't want to, or not because they're dissatisfied. It's because they have a decade or more of social contacts built up, you know, social contacts and culture built up in these platforms, and they just can't leave without giving all of that up. And that's a lot to ask of the consumer. What that problem
You're saying
really
my whole
is,
life has been on one of these social media companies, and they own my life,
and they don't.
It's their home. I can't ask for it back.
That's right. And these platforms, they don't work with one another. You're not tied into Gmail, for example. If you want to leave Gmail, you can. You can take all of your email with you. You can go to another email provider, and it will all just work because the email protocol is what people call interoperable. One works with the other. You can email from Gmail to Yahoo to Fastmail to whatever, but that's not true for social media. And so one potential solution, which is in the nature of the antitrust toolkit, is to require the platforms to be interoperable, to make it so that it is a more competitive and even playing field. I'd like to see that solution.
Absolutely.
So I want to talk about something that Lee said, because she said, for better or worse, we should use the word marketplace of ideas, because she's right. We're all First Amendment people, and we understand that, you know, Abrams versus the United States, Oliver Wendell Holmes introduced this idea, which, you know, I think it's worth debating for a moment here, that the marketplace of ideas exists, that it's good for representative democracy, that the founding fathers had this in mind when they had, in fact, adopted the First Amendment. They thought they would make us better citizens if we had the freedom to speak and freedom to hear and freedom of access. And that, according to Holmes, it's really like a marketplace because the better ideas will win out. So just open up as much speech as possible because the better ideas will win out over bad ideas. Except that it's not true. I mean, if it were true, we wouldn't have Nazis. We have Nazis. I thought the Nazis lost in 1945. Why are they still with us? It's not like I invented a better toothbrush in a marketplace of dental products, and therefore yours now becomes obsolete. Nazi ideology doesn't become obsolete. So that means that maybe we have a higher burden to say, if you're serving in the role of a public square, we have to do something for you. We cannot just let you operate like any private company. Something needs to happen in order to ensure public access, public information, the idea that the news itself is truthful and not misinformed. Is there any argument to looking at these entities as public, as common carriers like trains, where we say, we know you're a private company, but we have to step in because otherwise you're going to discriminate against an African-American and not let him on the train?
There, I think, is a huge appeal in considering the massive public benefits, right? Something that is an actual resource that is at an institutional level for everyone. I think it's a bit, it's hard for me not to smirk. It's a bit rich to consider calling individual people, social media sites, individual URLs, right? Something like a common carrier, because many people in the free speech community, although it was controversial, many of us, and certainly including ACLU, where I used to work, and now the National Coalition Against Censorship, certainly were in favor of net neutrality. And we said, whatever we do with the top layer that's actually presenting content to people, we have to be really cautious there, right, with government regulation, because it's actually made of ideas, right? But when we get to the lower level, when we're actually talking about the backbone, not before they monitor your call, can you call your cousin, right? Will they connect you? We've generally lost on that fight as a political matter, and folks have, I think, generally in bad faith, but made some arguments that the First Amendment should prevent net neutrality. So I think, it's an interesting thought experience as to whether or not you could go farther and consider the actual public spaces or kind of open spaces of individual sites or apps a kind of common carrier. But our public policy is leagues away from getting there. At a very basic level, we first need to establish the internet as a common good and a common carrier and our ability to connect. Before we get to the content layer, we're inviting the government in. We also have to be really mindful about viewpoint-based shenanigans, kind of motivating the government's regulatory approach there.
And you're more worried about that shenanigan than the shenanigan being perpetrated by the internet companies.
I'm worried about both. And when I said marketplace of ideas, look, Shane, I share some of your skepticism about the moral arc of our kind of public conversation always bending towards the better, right? I get that. But the part of the analogy I like is that as individual speakers, we should have some market power. It should be meaningful. We should be able to pick the digital equivalent of where do we put our soapbox so that the right people walking by can hear us, right? And right now, that market power is lacking. And outside of individual sites like Bluesky, where they've actually thought about a user experience and favored user control rather than a top-down, takedown, or content moderation regime, we don't have a lot of opportunities, of alternatives, and that's where that marketplace for me is failing. At the very basic level, we don't have net neutrality, right? We absolutely don't have a kind of hands-off government that isn't interested in regulating content. That's where the government is, and that makes everything worse. So we really are lacking the basic building blocks of establishing market power for speakers in the digital world, and that's what I want. I want consumer choice. I want user control. I want transparency and a digital equivalent of due process. And that's what gets us to a marketplace where we can actually pick and choose among ideas as opposed to just being kind of drones subject to invisible algorithms that are warping the very marketplace. But we don't even have the building blocks to talk really about public policy.
So, Mike, I know you want to jump in, but in case there's any time at the end, and this is going so nicely, by the way, well done, group. I'm listening to Lee and I'm thinking of Marshall McLuhan. I'm thinking she's making a Marshall McLuhan argument. The issue here is the internet and the algorithm. Forget the content. The message is the internet, and we're not even at the content point yet. We're so new at this, and she's making an interesting point that stop the content. Yeah. The message itself is the internet and those algorithms. We haven't figured that yet out. We'll figure that out. We'll get to content. Mike?
Yeah, so I think there are a few things, and I think even the original question that you asked about speech and the marketplace of ideas and then common carriers itself was somewhat contradictory, right? Because if you're talking about concerns about, Nazi ideology, for example, rising to the top, then a common carrier approach would lead to that kind of speech being considered equal and that there would be nothing that you could do about it. So you already have this contradiction there. And I think that the point that Lee was making is actually really, really important, which is there are differences between the underlying infrastructure and then the part that actually touches the consumer, the user, the public, the citizenry, in terms of what it is that they're allowed to do. And when you think about the concept of common carrier law, and there are people who are trying to turn social media into common carriers, I think that would be a disaster. Common carrier law is always about being a carrier, taking someone from point A to point B, and then, or something, people or goods or some, delivering the mail, whatever it is, and then getting rid of it. With social media, you're often hosting it in perpetuity. So are you saying that all content, if it's designated as a common carrier, that it has to host content forever? Can there be no situation in which that content ever comes down? The common carrier analogy doesn't exactly fit for this. unless you're talking about underlying infrastructure. So that's where, to get back to the point that Alex was making and Bluesky and all of this, that where the idea behind it is setting up the different layers where there is a core common infrastructure, a protocol that anyone can build on. And that is separate from the end user service where there's the actual user experience, allowing for there to be much more choice and control by the users at that end user level rather than deep in the infrastructure layer. And so I think we get confused when we start talking about them as if they're one. And I know that with like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, that we've always sort of seen them as one single thing, but understanding the different layers, I think, is actually really, really important to thinking through the actual consequences of different policy proposals about how this actually works.
And can I jump in with 2 points? So I absolutely agree. I don't think anybody wants social media feeds to be common carriers because nobody wants the social media feeds.
There are some people who claim they want it.
But the vast majority of users don't, because they don't want the feeds to feel obligated to serve up to them anything that comes in, in a chronologically first in, first out kind of style, because then they're going to be flooded with spam and hate and vitriol. They want tailored services, but they also want more control. And that gets to the second point, which is I have a kind of love-hate relationship with this marketplace of ideas metaphor. I think at a high level, it reflects a really interesting insight about how ideas work. But if you want to take it seriously, I think you need to acknowledge that in the marketplace of ideas, as in financial markets, there can be market failures. And the enduring question within the First Amendment community, certainly, but in society more broadly is, what are the appropriate and acceptable kinds of regulation to fix failures in the marketplace of ideas? And that's where so much of the discussion is. What I mentioned earlier, interoperability legislation, is one kind of fix to a marketplace failure. The failure there is the social media companies capture the market through the network effect, through the challenge of leaving a social media platform in which you've invested so much time and have built up so much of a network. But there are other failures too, like the ones that Lee is pointing to, which is a lack of information about what's going on. The platforms right now have very little incentive because of their dominance to tell you what of your private information they're using to do exactly what in serving you up what kind of information to what end. We don't know much about it because there's just not much of an economic interest in sharing it. It'd be nice if we could get to a place where we could address those failures.
But well, I'm going to get to this at some point, hopefully. But in Europe, the Digital Service Act, one of those elements that's required is that very thing, more transparency about the algorithm, right? Let us understand what's behind the curtain. And so I think that there's an example of regulation that, even a free speech absolutist, I think should take more seriously. Why? Well, because unfortunately, that's the point I'm making about the public square. We can think of the internet or social media companies like TikTok, and it's a video of me dancing with my cat. Okay, that's stupid, and there's a lot of that. But there's also, Lee's going, wait a minute, I dance with my cat on TikTok all the time.
Seriously, I don't appreciate the insult. This is my main content.
Lee, I'm so sorry, I forgot. I totally forgot. I forgot that you love that. That's your thing. So, but we learned that more and more young people get their news from TikTok. So right. Yes, there's the dancing with the cat, and there's also the news that we have to sort of recognize two things. One is, and I'm older than all of you, so I can tell you, when I was a little boy in New York City, when people went into the subway, they used to walk in after visiting the kiosk, the newspaper kiosk, and I'm not kidding, 5 newspapers. It was very common. People would take 5 newspapers. Imagine that. And at the end of the day, when they went home, they bought 2 more newspapers because the same newspapers had afternoon newspapers. So they would print them at 2 or 4 o'clock. So we forget this was before cable, before the internet, before everything. And in that situation, that's how you could be a well-informed person, right? But we don't have any more the Fairness Act, which is another issue that's interesting here. That could be, remember, there was a time until it was repealed that in order to have a broadcasting license, you had to obligate yourself to cover controversial topics and to give more of a diversity of viewpoint. So that means you can't have MSNBC or Fox, can't have either one of them. That in order to have been CBS News, it had to be that no one knew whether Walter Cronkite was a Democrat or a Republican. That's actually astonishing. that he had a third of the country, and he was anchoring the news, and 2/3 of the country, everyone was listening to this guy, and they didn't know what his politics are. So if you look at that reality of this is the role these entities play, and to go beyond the cats, but go, this is really they serve a public function. And therefore, we can't let this be the Wild West. We have to have something that ensures that misinformation, that people actually get the right facts, that they don't walk around thinking something about the vaccine that they shouldn't, or something about Hunter Biden's laptop that they shouldn't. And I'm saying that's really what's here, that I don't see enough of an acknowledgement of the importance, not here with you guys, but just in the general public conversation about who these entities are and how much we rely on them.
Look, truth matters, right? I mean, we're the National Coalition Against Censorship is an organization, and our mission is free speech in service of democracy. That it's not, just words for words sake, but the idea that it gives us a modicum of power in our democracy, right? And I'm not a First Amendment person because I don't think words and truth matter, right? That doesn't even make sense. I think
can you explain that again, Lisa? I'm not a First Amendment person.
I'm not a First Amendment attorney because I don't think words matter.
Oh, I see. You're not a pure free speech absolutist.
Right. I'm not a nihilist.
Right. You're not saying, I don't care what you say. It doesn't make a difference. Just say it.
I get up in the morning to defend free speech because I think words matter. And part of that is truth. I think where I bristle at how you presented that is I don't think having government as arbiter of that truth is likely to lead us to a place where either my dumb marketplace analogy works better or where we actually come closer to some objective truth. It has to be at the architectural level to fix what's broken about our ability to talk to each other. The reason that untrue content goes viral is because there's a powerful economic or political incentive, right? And that can happen at scale because there's very little competition, right, among the different entities, particularly social media companies, and because there's no data regulation. We have basically no data privacy law in the United States. So the economic incentives of having our data, of having, as Alex pointed out, an entire digital footprint of our life for years, right? Those have immense value economically to those companies, right? And they can mine that not just for virality, but to target an algorithm so we are being driven particular content that's in someone else's best interest to give us. And while there is an appeal of some kind of magic wand to fix it all up and have an arbiter of objective truth, I actually think that system is only possible because we don't have data privacy protections and we don't have a true diversity of options. So we all become captive cogs in a very profitable data machine. And I think that is hard to draw an analogy to something like the Equal Access Act, for example, where I have some empathy for the rule. Common carriers are being given a huge benefit from the government because they get to run on the cable spectrum, right? Much like a lot of the internet infrastructure. And we want to recognize that part of the government return on investment, right, of offering these massive companies access to our core cable broadband spectrum is that we're going to ask you to give declared candidates equal time by parties. Now, whatever heartburn I may have about that kind of more socialist regulation of speech, it is at least an objectively identifiable one. These are registered candidates, right? And you kind of have to give them both equal time. Putting aside my nihilism about whether or not the two-party system is working as well as it should be for democracy, there's not really a way to apply, I think, a similarly objective and administrable content rule on the internet. So I just favor looking at the architecture and fixing it so it looks something more like a functioning market before we get to, we need the government's help to figure out content and truth. That to me is far away from where we should be.
Can I just respond to that real quick? I think a lot of the discussion is we're talking about symptoms, not the underlying disease. And I think that's what Lee is getting at. I think it's what Alex was getting at originally at the beginning of this conversation where he was talking about control. The issue is that when you have certain nodes of control that have tremendous power, they become targets of political influence. What we've seen, especially over the last decade and a half, is that we've recognized that there are certain points of control over the messaging, over the story, over the spin on anything that are so important and so valuable because they can move large segments of the population to believe one thing or another, and then they become targets of control. So that's what we've seen, certainly with the takeover of Twitter, with the takeover now of CBS News, of other points of control of messaging become a target. And if the response to that is, oh, well, the government has to step in and say, this is what is allowed and this is what is not, you've now created the largest single point of control that now becomes an even bigger target for people to then control. The better way about it, which is what Lee was getting at and what Alex was talking about early on, and which I, am a big proponent of, is that if you can move away those points of control, move away those points of concentration, then you lose that ability for any one person to target that, to control the message for political reasons or for economic reasons or whatever it might be. Spread that out and we get at that rather than going in and saying, well, we need a rule to fix it at the end. That's the symptom. That's what we find out after we've had all these other problems that led to this. And what we're trying to get at is, can we get to a world where that isn't even possible, where no one has the ability to take that kind of control over anything? Then you don't need a rule that says, oh, everybody needs to be fair or misinformation shouldn't be allowed, because there isn't someone who is powerful enough to make that message resonate in a way that twists
but these are oligopolies, Mike. I mean,
yes, right now, but they don't need to be.
I'm saying, don't you think that the system is set up to preserve the oligarchy?
Yeah, but if so, then the question is, yes, right now, absolutely. So we need a different system, but that we're not going to get that system by saying, let's have another central point of control, an even more powerful central point of control to push back on these other ones, right?
Okay.
The way to do it is to get rid of as much of those nexuses of control and to spread that out so that it's not so powerful anymore.
Alex, you got something? Can I move on?
Well, I was going to add just one thing, which is it's not just that. I mean, I agree with everything that Mike and Lee just said. It's not just that they become attractive targets for people who are trying to assert political control or hijack the system. It's that just by virtue of the fact that we have three people, really, who control the algorithms that decide how information is spread through society, it leads to a kind of homogeneity in the structure of our public discourse that itself is a challenge for a democracy, because it becomes very hard for today's minority views to become tomorrow's majority views when everything in society is structured according to just a small handful of profit-driven motives. And it's not that if we had more choice that all of the companies in this more rich pluralistic ecosystem, it's not that each of those individual platforms in that ecosystem would all of a sudden have a kumbaya approach to the distribution of speech. It would just be that we would have more heterogeneity. We'd have more diversity in the decisions about what rises to the top and what doesn't. And one of the things that you have in a homogeneous environment is you see the viral spread of things. My favorite analogy, and I was a biology major, at one point in my life, my favorite analogy is the reason why it is good to have genetic diversity in a population is because in a diverse population, viruses don't spread as easily. But in a homogeneous one, viruses can figure out how to hijack the system and they spread. And that's what we're seeing on social media today.
Wow. All right. Well, isn't part of the problem Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act? For the audience that may not know what this is a piece of legislation that sort of foreshadows the world in which we live. When the information superhighway was being constructed, they were incentivized, the early pioneers of the internet, pre-social media, that said, look, I understand what you're doing. You're building an entire infrastructure that we can't even imagine. It sounds like science fiction, but it's cool. Keep working. And in order to incentivize you, we'll let you know that you will have an immunity going forward, that third parties can't sue you. Individuals that use your platforms won't be able to sue you. And the reason why we're doing this is because we're trying to incentivize you not to have any doubt that someone's going to come after you later because they were harmed by your site. So there's that incentive. And there's also the understanding you told us, you lied. You told us that you don't care about stuff, that you don't have any political preferences or ideological preferences. You're an engineer. You build a highway. It's on the internet. That's your thing. You don't care. But what we learned in some of these presidential elections, oh my God, they care, right? Before Twitter cared, everyone cared. And that's really where a lot of this backlash came from. They said, wait a minute, I thought that this would be an open field in which you guys would show no preferences or any prejudices. And so what we're seeing is this inability for private individuals to bring lawsuits against these entities because they're protected from civil liability by this act. And I'm going to get to the Supreme Court a little later, but it does seem like the Supreme Court had at least one opportunity to repeal, revoke, invalidate the Section 230, the Communications Decency Act, and chose not to. And I'm not sure, I'm looking at your faces, and I'm not sure whether you three think it's a good idea either. I think you think, you know what, I think overall, I mean, you know, Mike sits on a board and he's going, no, I kind of like the idea of Section 230 because I'm a board member I've got a fiduciary duty to them, and this protects us.
So let me respond first. I think that the description that you have of Section 230 is a little bit misleading as well. It was never put in place with the idea that, the sites are not going to have an opinion, right? And I've spoken to the two authors of Section 230 multiple times, and they've written about this and they filed on this. The law itself is very clear. The idea was the opposite of that in many ways. The idea behind Section 230 was to allow any platform to put in place the kinds of rules that they want without fear of then being challenged and sued over the rules that they put in place and how they enforce it, because the idea was that they were enabling people to create different kinds of communities. And they've even said,
nobody thought the rules would be exclusionary.
No, but they did. They specifically have said, if someone wanted to create a community for all Republicans and said no Democrats allowed, that should be allowed, and you shouldn't get sued over it, right? You're creating a community. If somebody wants to create a community that is for people who wanted to talk about gardening, and someone comes in and they want to talk about race cars, you want to say, no, you're breaking the rules and you should be able to leave, and they shouldn't be able to sue you over that.
If I'm a Republican and I'm on the site because that is my community, and I just said something that you don't like, you'll take it down. And I'm in the right community, but I'm still being heavily curated.
Yes, but that is the nature of editorial control. If you're talking about that, so I think that the underlying point of Section 230, which I think is more important, is simply that it says that the platform infrastructure shouldn't be held liable for the speech of someone else. That is the key point, which I think is like something that feels like common sense when you think about it, right? If I am just allowing you to come into my living room, I shouldn't be liable if you say something in that living room that then violates the law. That's still on you. That's still on the speaker. The speaker is still very much liable.
I have an answer to that, but let's hear what the two of you have to say about 230.
So let me start this way. I am not categorically opposed to the idea of considering changes to Section 230. I just haven't seen a proposal that would actually solve the problems it claims it would solve, and that wouldn't cause more problems than it claims to be solving. And part of the reason is that people, when they talk about Section 230 reform, they seem to have in mind some of the problems we've seen in social media over the last 5 years, the spread of disinformation, the spread, and the like. And amending 230 or even getting rid of 230 wouldn't really have any effect on the platform's hosting of that kind of speech, because that kind of speech isn't unlawful. It is not unlawful to believe that Donald Trump won the 2020 election. It's not unlawful to think that the COVID vaccine doesn't work. That's just a give and take of ordinary political conversation. I think if we got rid of Section 230, though, what we would see is we would see the platforms moderating all sorts of socially beneficial speech. Anytime somebody made an accusation on social media of, say, harassment in the workplace or abuse by, human rights abuses by a company, those sorts of allegations absolutely would get over-moderated in a post-Section 230 world, because those would be potentially defamatory statements, and the platforms would have absolutely no way of knowing, no way of adjudicating the truth of those statements, and so they would fear liability. And if somebody accused a major CEO of harassing his employees, the platforms would have an overwhelming economic incentive to take down that accusation for fear that that company is going to sue. And they'd have almost no incentive to keep it up because they don't care all that much about any individual post because they have billions of posts on their site every single day. So that is my concern. Like I said, I'm not categorically opposed. I just haven't seen a productive proposal.
I'm totally with Alex, not categorically opposed. I don't think Section 230 kind of was, born out of the forehead of Zeus or whatever, but it did, I think. I will give it credit for being fairly prescient about what the young internet really needed to be a viable form of media in a way that it wouldn't, the same liability structure that we use for newspapers wouldn't have been practical at scale, right? There is not actually a human hand reviewing every bit of content. In order to enable user submitted content, in order for a site like Yelp to ever have come into existence, 230 needed to exist. And so are there alternatives where we could get that slider better? Maybe in theory, like Alex, I haven't seen one. But what I worry about now about amending 230, given how the internet has formed and to the extent we have diversity of opinion on there, 230 is a major contributor. And the way that it's structured now, I worry that if we revoked Section 30, right, if we just got rid of Section 30, there is no question that that would deepen our existing problems of concentration, monopoly, and homogeneity. The reason we have diversity of opinion right now is hugely because of Section 30.
And this is a really, really important point that I think often gets missed in the debate of Section 230. What Lee just said, if you were to remove Section 230, let's just say we revoked it right now, what would happen would be certainly a lot more lawsuits, but the lawsuits, most of them would be over protected legal First Amendment protected speech. Companies like Meta would win the lawsuits. They would cost a lot more than they do under Section 230. This is all like deep in the technical weeds, but like with Section 230, you get those lawsuits tossed at the earliest stage. It costs maybe $100,000. Without it, you have to run through a huge process, which is probably $2 million. Facebook, Meta can afford a bunch of these sort of $2 million lawsuits. The small companies like Bluesky and others cannot. It would drive them out of business and it would leave the biggest centralized companies in place.
So let me respond to what Mike said earlier, which is to say, well, it kind of makes sense. Why should an internet company be responsible for what some third party posts? And what I would say is that the Supreme Court largely agrees with everything Mike has said, because with the exception of this most recent case in Texas, with the age verification for the use of pornographic websites, for the most part, the Supreme Court has been ruling 9-0 in favor of internet companies. And here's the one that I want to raise, because most people don't know about this, you three do, and this is my answer to Mike. There's the one from several terms ago that dealt with the anti-terrorism laws. Mm-hmm. And this had to do with Google, Alphabet, and Twitter. And you had a family who sent their kid to Paris on a semester abroad. She's a young woman. She's doing exactly what you're supposed to do: go to a cafe in Paris and have a pastry. And she was gunned down by an ISIS terrorist. The parents said, whoa, we sent our kid to Paris. And what we know about Google is that YouTube, which is owned by Alphabet, teaches you how to make a bomb, helps recruit terrorists, radicalizes people by using the extremist sermons of Islamist clerics. The Supreme Court said, no, they have nothing to do with this. They're merely a delivery system. Their connection to the crime is to attenuate it, except for one thing, Mike. The people that are interested in making matzo ball soup are not the same people that are interested in how to make a bomb in your mother's kitchen supplies, meaning that YouTube knows what to give me if I'm a terrorist. They know what Thane is going to want if he wants to make a bomb, and that's exactly how these communities are created. So it's not like we're just a platform. We're not just a platform. We make money on the very thing Lee said before: data accumulation. We learn about you. We learn about what you're interested in, and we'll help you find your friends. And in this instance, they lost the daughter because too many people found their friends, and she was killed in a hail of bullets. So I'm saying it just let's remember. Now, remember, Supreme Court ruled 9-0 in favor of conservatives. What does that tell you? It says Thane's argument is nonsense because even Clarence Thomas, who you think would be sitting with me on this, I think at one point said, and I was shocked, he said, well, it's really like a telephone. They're using it like a telephone, and you don't hold the telephone companies responsible because people call each other up and plan to kill somebody. Anyway, I just wanted to raise that.
And I think it's valid to raise that, to have that discussion. But, Clarence Thomas wrote that decision in that rule, in the 9-0 ruling, and got everyone else to sign on to it. And the point that he made was really clear, was that there has to be a clear connection between that. And in that case in particular, there was no obvious connection. You just had terrorist activity, and you had claims that were never actually supported by any of the evidence directly in the case that some terrorists in the same group also used the platform. There was no evidence presented that this particular terrorist attack was planned on the platform. There was no indication that the groups came together because they were using the content on the platform. You added a bunch of those to the things, and in a case where that was shown, there might be a different discussion to be had. But this is the problem when you automatically say, like, well, if we take away the protections for the intermediaries, then companies themselves are going to say, well, we're not going to host any content that might lead to anything that someone could accuse us of. The fact that this was the terrorist attack and the platform itself were so disconnected made it so obvious that you had that 9-0 ruling, and Clarence Thomas writing very clearly about it, actually. That sort of made the point. But if you were to say, well, as we start to, if you have any connection to this, then the platform itself can be blamed. The platforms are going to respond and say, we're not going to host anything that's even remotely controversial. We're not going to host any content about civil liberties stuff that might get people upset. We're not going to host any content about LGBTQ people because, that might get people upset and someone's going to sue us. We're not going to host.
It's getting gunned down in a region.
But if you're going to argue that that's going to lead to violence, these platforms are going to take down all of that content. And as a California court said recently, you're just going to have Sesame Street. That's the only thing you're going to have left on the internet if you're allowing companies to be blamed for things like that.
So the sky fall down in Europe because the European Union has passed the Digital Services Act. And apparently, I think the first element of that is to remove illegal content. I'm not sure, I could be wrong. You guys follow this much more closely. I'm not sure that you can learn how to make a bomb in your mother's kitchen in Belgium on YouTube.
Well, but part of the problem,
I'm not sure you're allowed to. I think that YouTube knows that in Europe, oh my God, we cannot have stuff like this on because we're going to get fined and slapped around. And there's a lot of consequences in Europe for this.
But the facts of, there are actually two consolidated cases that you're talking about. The facts of those cases were horrendous. But part of the problem, which Mike was kind of alluding to, is that they were not based on allegations that the platforms had actually trafficked in unlawful conduct or unlawful speech. They were based on allegations that there was some broad and nebulous category of speech known as terrorist speech, which is not a category of speech that any court has ever said is unprotected by the First Amendment, kind of like bomb-making speech, which is also protected in the United States. And if you're going to hold that the platforms can be held liable for that kind of speech, that's actually not a rule that's specific to the platforms. It's a much broader rule about just blowing up, standard First Amendment protections in a context where, doing so is going to have all these ripple effects that Mike is talking about. If what we were talking about were just really narrow rules about specific kinds of speech, it'd be easier to have the conversation. But that's not what those cases teed up.
So, no, I was going to say, so Lee, you and Alex probably have buddies in Europe who do the kind of work that you do.
Yeah.
Right? You've probably gone to symposia and you hang out and talk about stuff.
That's
you might have discussed this. Or what do they tell you? Do they say, you know what, this regulation is just terrible on censorship grounds? It's terrible for free speech grounds. People forget that we are way more permissive when it comes to free speech than Europe. In the United States, in Skokie, Illinois, you can have a gathering of neo-Nazis marching on a community of Holocaust survivors, and there'll be Jewish lawyers representing them for the ACLU. And that's been considered an enormous victory for free speech and civil liberties in the United States. People are really proud of something like that. But in Europe, especially in Austria or Germany, if the neo-Nazis want to march, they march them straight to jail. And the question is, are we better off having them march in front of the Holocaust survivors than what they do in Germany? Or is it just so abusive that free speech and civil liberties mean much less in Europe precisely because of these restrictions?
Thane, there's so many things baked into that question. There's so many ways I could respond to that. I think I'll pick two. The first is fundamentally caring about free expression and the First Amendment is an American worldview, or at least mine is, right? It is rooted in US culture and the kind of constitutional order that we have. I feel personally a little uncomfortable exporting that to other countries and other countries with some sense of superiority. I mean, we also have our Second Amendment slider set in a very different place, but I think other countries have different histories and different contexts where I'm not going to say we're right, they're wrong, certainly not on that one. And they have such a completely different cultural context and history that just cherry picking the First Amendment and kind of shaming another country for putting the slider in a different place, not my jam. And I don't think it's particularly helpful because it's a uniquely, I think, American policy question when we're talking about the First Amendment and its protections. But at the same time, I have taught, for example, comparative international free speech and what that means and looks like in different countries. And the one bit of self-satisfied, I guess, American backpatting that I occasionally allow myself when I've taught those classes is to highlight that European countries that have, for example, hidden the swastika, do not necessarily result in places with fewer Nazis, neo-Nazis, or even neo-Nazis winning elections, right? But just to take rural northern France as one example, right? So I think it's tempting sometimes to compare directly, but I think the question is, it feels almost ineffably philosophically unknowable to know whether that the moral arc of the universe or human dysfunction, improves or gets worse based on whether we hide the speech and evidence of the ideas in people's head. But what I do think is universal is speech rights impact culture. And that's a reciprocal kind of, right? How we talk about the Overton window or the fact that most Americans will kind of pull out of their pocket at some point if they're talking to a free speech lawyer, the phrase, everyone knows you can't shout fire in a crowded theater, right? That's not true. And it's like fingers on a chalkboard to a First Amendment lawyer, but the cultural fixation it has on people is so real. So law and culture, particularly in one country, just reverberate with each other. And we're now at the tail end of 100 years of First Amendment law and grappling with that as part of the values that we expect and think about when we're talking about the internet. That's just true. And the second thing is hiding speech. Look, speech can cause harm, psychological harm. Like the idea of a survivor confronting an actual Nazi is not without harm. And I don't
in 1977.
In 1977. And by the way, Skokie, Illinois was a town made up overwhelmingly of survivors.
That's why they picked that town.
Intentional choice. Exactly. So, and I know your history, Thane. It's just important to remember this wasn't this was a targeted attempt to cause harm in the community, at least mentally. And I don't think it hurts the First Amendment or hurts free expression to acknowledge that. The question is, at least under our First Amendment regime, is it better or worse to hide it? And what is the outcome we're looking for? If we're simply talking about protecting someone from the acute psychological harm or discomfort they're feeling in that moment of confrontation, that's a reasonable question to ask. But for me, I think of free expression as a broader right in service of democracy. And as I mentioned before, something that ensures that individual people have some power in their collective democracy. Like you can't shut me up before I try to believe and associate and print and petition the government, right? All those actions in the First Amendment, those are the actions of a free people that have the ability to speak back to their government. The use case I'm worried about, and I think I have to be, with no lack of empathy for the harm in that moment, is just hiding those ideas or giving the government the ability to hide those ideas or censor them, is that more likely or less likely to maintain our democracy?
Alex?
Fundamentally, and I think it's less likely. When we give the government the power to play that gatekeeper, it doesn't make the ideas go away, but it centralizes and gatekeeps one entity, our government's ability to control that dialogue and pick winners or losers.
Lee, just to be clear, you're saying, I'm not disagreeing, you're saying that in some instances, speech has a way of undermining liberal or representative democracy. It's not great. I wish it didn't happen, but I think it would be worse to try to regulate.
It's the lesser evil, and I'm happy. I'm comfortable calling it an evil.
I mean, I hesitate to try to add to Lee's really eloquent explanation of why free speech matters. But let me add two things, or let me double down on one and add another.
Well, but when you do this, Alex, one of the things that Lee didn't respond to that maybe she'll come back to is, what do you hear from your compatriots in Europe? Right? Are they complaining? Are they kicking the curb? Like, how upset are they? They're going, you know what?
Well,
as it turns out, it kind of works.
What I've heard from like colleagues of mine in Germany, for example, is that the table has turned so entirely in the other direction that that Germany is now cracking down on pro-Palestinian speech in a way that would make anyone committed to a notion of free speech blush. And I don't think it has led necessarily to some kind of policy nirvana or outcome nirvana. But at a higher level, I'd say this. A commitment to free speech is not a commitment to a particular outcome. It is a commitment to a process. It's a commitment to the notion that in a democracy where people necessarily have different ideas, we need a way of talking to one another, of resolving those disagreements. And it is, I think, based on a recognition that the cost of disagreement, while real, it can actually, it causes real harm. I don't think any principled free speech advocate is committed to these ideas because they think speech is powerless. To the contrary, they're committed to these ideas because they think speech is powerful, because it can enrage people, incite people, provoke them. But it reflects the notion that generation over generation, we cannot succeed as a plural society unless we have ground rules that everybody can abide by for resolving our disagreements and arriving at a policy decision that not everybody will agree on, but they will agree on the process by which we got there. And if if instead we adopt a rule that allows the incumbents to entrench their power by shutting down the speech that the current majority disfavors, it will inevitably breed dissatisfaction in yesterday's minority, which over time will express itself. And it will express itself by trying to burn down the system. And I think that's what we're seeing. I think that's what we're seeing in countries around the world right now. People are calling it a kind of populism. I think it's in part a response to a sense, whether you think they're right or not, a sense that they have been shut out of the political conversation. And I think the only way out is to recommit to the notion that in a plural society, we have to resolve our disagreements through speech, and I will also say, I don't think a commitment to free speech requires you to adopt the American First Amendment tradition. I think there are plenty of countries that are fundamentally democratic that have very different rules about where exactly you draw the line. I agree with Lee that the lines that we draw in our country are the result of a lot of contingent historical and cultural factors, and that in Germany, you can understand why they would draw the lines elsewhere because of their very particular history.
Well, right. I was going to say one reason, and I'll let you finish that up, is that we don't use the word dignity in any of our founding documents, and they do. Human dignity is all over. They won't shut up about it in the German Constitution, and they don't shut the hell. The Holocaust freaked them out, and now the words dignity come up in every sentence, and so that's one of the reasons that's different, I think.
Yeah, as well it should have. Well, and just to my point, I don't think that there's one version of free speech that has been proven to be the right one. There are a lot of different experiments out there. I think it's good to have the experiments out there. I think it's good that the United States has its particularly robust experiment. But like Lee, I'm not willing to say that ours is the one true version of free speech.
All right, one last question. We'll start with Mike. AI. How is AI, and I ask you this because because of Techdirt and because of Bluesky, everybody thinks their job is going to be obsolete. Is content moderating no longer even necessary if AI can be figured out? And if it can be figured out, can we then believe that it'll be much less measured and less prejudicial because it doesn't have, none of us are neutral. All of us are people in some regard. Somebody cut us off in our car. Someone didn't say hello in Starbucks. And the next thing you know, we have no idea what effect that had when we saw a post and we took it down because we saw that person's last name. And that AI will not respond that way because the AI doesn't drink coffee and has no it doesn't have any internal prejudices. So maybe some of this can go away by creating standards that Lee said, when we finally figure things out, we can get to content and then AI can help us establish what those rules are.
It's a really big question for a final question because there's a whole bunch of different ways you can go. I would start by saying, I don't think that there are many people within the AI space who would say that AI doesn't have prejudice. I think AI has tons of prejudice built into it. It is based on the training data, how it's been trained, the weights, all of it is prejudice. I think what is interesting and where the possibility is around AI and speech online is more in the personalization and the control. To get back to what we started talking about at the very beginning, whereas right now, if you're on a major platform, you are reliant on the decisions that are made by that company and the rules that that company makes. One of the amazing and potentially interesting things, it will depend very much on the actual implementation, who implements it and how, is the ability to use AI tools to allow for much greater customization by the end user. What if I want to say, I don't want to deal with any politics on Wednesdays? I have just decided Wednesdays are not my politics days. There's no social media platform that's going to do that. But if I had an AI tool that would handle the moderation for me, it could take into account the specifics of my situation, no matter how weird or strange they are, and perhaps present a better, more customized, more personalized world in which I am in control, not Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or some random billionaire who has their own interests. And so I think where the interesting part is with the AI being able to allow for much more personalization, at the same time, also ending the process of right now, the way that content moderation works is actually a whole bunch of humans who are exposed to a whole ton of awful content that they have to spend their lives sorting through to protect other people. And often it is marginalized people, it is people in foreign countries that are not well off, who have no better job opportunities, who are then forced to effectively suffer through being exposed to terrible content. And where the AI technology might help is to no longer have to make people suffer in that way, while also allowing for users to have a much more personalized and customized experience. And I think that is a real opportunity. How it actually plays out in practice is still to be seen. But I think there's an important potential there.
All right, I'm afraid our evening has just come to an end. We may have discussed censorship, but we had a very open dialogue, robust conversation about the dark side of the internet and whether or not, yes, internet providers, social media companies, yes, they have First Amendment rights that the government can't tamper with. But do these companies owe any First Amendment obligations to their audience? And that's what we discussed today in a very, I think, entertaining and smart way, which is sort of the FOLCS style. I want to thank, of course, Lee, Mike, and Alex. We hope to have you back. And until next time, I'm Thane Rosenbaum for FOLCS, the 92NY Talk Series, and the National Coalition Against Censorship. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks again, Thane.